She begged, "Please help me, my child is dying." And the man she thought would turn her away became the one who saved them both. In the frozen wilds of Montana, winter 1874, Clara Wynn, a poor widow shunned by her town for loving a Comanche man, trudges through waist-deep snow with her fever-burning daughter in her arms. Every breath cuts like glass, every step feels like her last. Behind her lie the whispers of hatred. No one helps a woman like that. And ahead, only a rumor. A lone man in the mountains who once healed soldiers, then vanished after the war took his family. When Clara collapses at his cabin door, half frozen and broken, she expects indifference, maybe pity. Instead, Caleb Vance, the haunted recluse once called the Mountain Doctor, lifts the child from her arms and does what no one else dared. He fights to bring life back from death. That single act will bind their fates beneath the storm. As blizzards rage and old wounds resurface, two exiled hearts will learn that love can rise even from ashes. And by the time spring returns to the mountains, the man who swore never to feel again will carve 6 quiet words into the pine outside his cabin, a promise stronger than any prayer. She's still breathing, and so am I. The Bitterroot Mountains stretched endless and unforgiving, their peaks veiled in mist and snow like ancient gods watching from afar. The wind moved through the pines with a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry the memory of every soul lost to winter. Beneath that sky of gray steel, a small cabin stood alone on the ridge, its walls scarred by time, its chimney whispering faint curls of smoke into the cold. Inside, Caleb Vance lived as though the world beyond the timberline had ceased to exist. A former field surgeon from the Union Army, he had come to the mountains 9 winters ago and never looked back. His cabin smelled of pine resin, ash, and solitude. The rifle above his hearth had not been fired in years. On a shelf beside it lay relics of another life, a rusted scalpel, a wedding band tied with a strip of deerskin, and a child's carved wooden toy burned on one side. Outside, the storm pressed hard against the world, swallowing every sound except the hiss of wind. The snow fell heavy, relentless. Somewhere below the ridge, a faint shadow moved across the frozen pass, a woman, thin and trembling, clutching something close to her chest. Her name was Clara Wynn, and she had been walking for 3 days through hell in silence. By the time she reached the mountain's edge, the smoke from Caleb's chimney looked less like a sign of life and more like a final prayer. Clara's legs buckled as she climbed the final rise. The snow reached her knees, clinging like iron chains. Her shawl, once pale blue, was now a crust of frost. She could no longer feel her fingers, only the weight in her arms, a small limp bundle wrapped in a wool blanket. The child's face was ashen, lips parted, breath too faint to see. "Hold on, Ella," Clara whispered, though her voice was barely more than a rasp. "Mama's almost there." The words scattered in the wind. Through the blur of white, a flicker of orange glowed ahead, the promise of firelight. She staggered toward it, stumbling, falling, rising again. Her boots tore at the ice, her knees bled through torn cloth. When at last she reached the cabin, her strength gave out. She struck the door with her fist, once, twice, before collapsing into the snow. The door creaked open. A man filled its frame, tall and broad-shouldered, beard flecked with frost, eyes cold as the mountain itself. He said nothing, only looked down at the woman sprawled across his threshold. Clara tried to speak. Her lips were blue, her voice broken. "Please, help me. My child, she's dying." For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then the man knelt, hands rough but steady, and lifted the bundle from her arms. He hesitated as he pulled back the blanket. A thin gasp escaped him. There, against his palm, he felt it weak, but real. A heartbeat. And in that instant, Caleb Vance knew. The mountain would no longer keep its silence. The door slammed against the wind, and the world shrank to a room of timber, smoke, and breath. Caleb Vance crossed the threshold in 2 strides, a bundle of chilled wool and failing life in his arms, the woman's shadow wavering behind him like a candle about to gutter. He set the child upon a low table beside the hearth where the light was steady, then turned to haul Clara Wynn out of the snow with one arm. Her weight surprised him, not for heaviness, but for the absence of it, like carrying a coat that had forgotten the body it once warmed. Stay awake, he said, voice low but firm. You hear me? Clara nodded, or tried to. Her lips trembled without color. The wind clawed at the door, as Caleb threw the iron bolt, shouldered a beam across it, and turned back into the fragile circle of firelight. He had spent 9 winters refusing to remember, but his hands remembered without asking him. His breath steadied. His vision narrowed to the little girl's face, gray-blue and glassy, lashes rimed with frost that looked like ash. He stripped off the wet blanket, then the damp dress beneath. Leaving a thin chemise he pressed dry cloth against. The child's chest struggled under his palm, shallow, skipping. Clara lurched forward and would have fallen if not for the old hound, who rose from near the hearth and blocked her gently with a ribbed shoulder. The dog, bear-sized, brindled, and solemn, woofed once, almost scolding, then circled to lie with his warmth against Clara's shins. Caleb tossed a second quilt toward her without looking up. Wrap yourself from the feet first, he said. If your legs thaw before your core, you'll faint and crush us both. Clara obeyed, jaw clacking. Her name is Ella, she managed, teeth beating time. She had fever. Then it stopped. The shaking. Fever that stops in cold is a liar, Caleb muttered. He found the little pulse in Ella's throat and counted silently, not liking the gaps in the music. Don't let go of that quilt. Sit. Breathe through your nose. He stoked the fire until it roared, fed by pitch-heavy splits. Over the hearth hung copper hooks, blackened with years. From a shelf he took a narrow-necked bottle, a cloth pouch, a tin cup. Hot water hissed. He crushed dried willow bark in a mortar, the smell clean and bitter, then pinched a mix of ground juniper and peppermint and rubbings that looked like char. He hesitated, hearing a voice more than a memory. Not too much of the ash. It opens, but it scorches. He tempered the pinch to a whisper. Clara's gaze darted between the child and the stranger's hands. She tried to rise. The room lurched. Please, she said, and the whole winter fit inside the word. Caleb set a warm cloth on Ella's chest and neck, another at the crown of her head where heat hides and kills. He tipped a drop of whiskey into the child's mouth, then lifted her shoulders and back and rubbed along the ribs with 2 fingers, feather-light circles that coaxed breath, as one might coax a shy bird to eat from an open palm. Ella's lips pinked by a shade hardly there. Come on, little star, he whispered, surprising himself with the old endearment. Just a breath and then another. But the hound thumped his tail once on the floor. Clara shut her eyes as if praying might be less impossible if she didn't have to see. For a moment that stretched and thinned until it might snap. Nothing changed. Then Ella sighed, a sound so quiet it could have been imagined, and flicked her lashes against the warmth on her face. Caleb didn't exhale. He counted again, listening, adjusting, the little pulse at the throat steadied by a hair. He looked up finally past the smoke-limbed rafters, past the antlers above the door, to Clara. Her features were fine under the grime, stubbornly delicate like a sketch never finished for fear of ruining it. The bones of hunger had carved shadows beneath her cheekbones, but in her eyes there was nothing weak, only a ferocity that had outwalked 3 days of winter. Take off your boots, Caleb said, and your outer skirt. Hang what's wet there. He jerked his chin toward a line near the hearth. You're no good to her if you freeze. Clara's fingers fumbled at knots turned to iron by the cold. Without comment, Caleb reached over, slit the laces clean with a pocket blade, and freed her feet. He thrust a dry pair of socks toward her from a box by the wall, then returned to the table. Why did they send you out alone? The question escaped before he had decided whether to ask it. They didn't send me, she said after a moment. They turned their backs. Caleb said nothing to that. He'd seen entire regiments turn their backs on children, on wounded men, on each other. The shape of a refusal never surprised him. Still, the bruise of it looked fresh on her. Ella stirred and coughed, a shallow, papery sound. He lifted her carefully and patted the back in a rhythm he could still beat with his own breath. 2 quick, 1 slow, pause. The cough deepened and produced a spit-thin thread of phlegm that he dabbed away with a cloth. Better, he said, not good, but better. Clara rose from the hearth and crossed the 2 paces to the table with the caution of someone walking on a split log over a river. She touched the edge with her fingertips as if asking permission. Can I hold her hand, he said, Keep her fingers warm. Talk to her but soft. Clara obeyed. Ella, sweetheart, you hear Mama? Her voice changed. The sharp edges of it smoothed. Here I am, we found the light. Caleb blew out the candle on the far shelf so the hearth would do the warming. Too many sources of heat confused the body. He moved around the table, movements economical. The room a map his hands had drawn 1,000 times. He plucked a sprig of rabbit tobacco from a hanging bundle, crumbled it, and set it to steep with the willow in the cup. The scent rose earthy, oddly clean, like wet stone. He tested the heat on his wrist, then touched the rim to Ella's mouth and let a drop roll inside. Her throat flexed, the smallest swallow. Clara closed her eyes, and a breath left her that might have been the last frayed thread of something she had tied around her own chest to keep it from bursting. When she opened her eyes again, their brightness had shifted from fever to focus. You were a doctor, she said, not a question. I was a surgeon, he corrected. Field tents, mud and lanterns, fewer miracles than you think. His tone made it clear he would not say more. She looked at the bottle on the shelf, the neat wrists of bandage cloth rolled like snowdrifts, the way each hook and knife had a place to return to. But you still kept the tools, she murmured. I kept what I couldn't throw away. He glanced at the hound. And what refused to leave. The dog wagged, lifted his head, then settled his muzzle on Clara's feet, adding warmth where the fire couldn't reach. A silence settled, not comfortable yet, but possible. Ella's breath caught. Clara stiffened. Caleb was already moving. The tiny chest had paused too long between rises. The room narrowed to the span between his two hands. Lay her flat, he said. He tilted Ella's head gently to open the airway, slipped a thin reed hollowed and sanded smooth between her teeth, and breathed in, then out, measured, letting his own lungs teach hers the old dance. His ear hovered at her mouth, counting the answer in faint whiffs of air. He pressed 2 fingers beneath the breastbone and vibrated lightly, an Apache trick he had once learned, not to push the heart, but to startle it politely. Ella, Clara whispered, knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. Listen to him. Listen. A cough, then another. Ella drew in a ragged breath and shuddered. Color crept like sunrise under the skin. Caleb set the reed aside and bowed his head for 1 heartbeat longer than necessary. When he looked up, his eyes were not the mountain's steel anymore, but the river beneath it, cold, yes, and deep, and moving. Clara's own eyes had filled without tears falling. Thank you, she said, and there was no word in it but the one she meant. He reached for the cup again. Small sips every few minutes, he said. If she chokes, stop. If she sleeps, let her. If she stops breathing again. He paused. The space waited, then nodded at the reed. You saw what I did. I did, Clara said. She didn't tremble. The night climbed the walls. The storm leaned inside like a tired giant, shouldering a door it no longer meant to break. Hours pressed by in increments of cloth warmed and replaced, of sips given and refused, of breaths counted and recounted. Twice Ella woke, once with a thin whimper, once with a searching hand. Each time Clara's voice found the old lullabies she had smuggled from a life that had been set on fire behind her. Caleb listened without meaning to. He didn't know the words but recognized the truth in their shape. Not bargains with God. Not threats, not debts. Songs as simple as bread. You're not from here, he said finally, unable to place the melody to any church he'd heard. Clara smiled the sort of smile that looks back over its shoulder. My mother had a friend who taught me. She said some songs are bridges. You don't need to know the far shore to step on them. Caleb turned the phrase over once and put it where he kept tools he wasn't sure he would ever use but couldn't quite discard. Near midnight, Ella's breathing eased. The line between each inhale and exhale became less jagged, more rope than chain. Caleb lifted her carefully to shift the cloth beneath and caught the weight of her as he might catch a fledgling, half afraid to crush it, half afraid it would take off and leave his hands empty. Clara had dozed, sitting upright. The hound's great head lay in her lap, his ears making a crooked halo. Caleb could have left her sleeping. He didn't. You should lie down, he said. I will. She blinked and straightened. When she does. She's doing it now, He nodded at the rhythm that had become steady enough to trust for the next stretch of time. There. He let the word anchor the room. He rose and crossed to the narrow bed built into an alcove. He shook out a buffalo robe, put an extra quilt folded at the foot. "You'll take the bed. I'll keep watch." Clara's instinctive refusal rose to her lips and died there. Pride had kept her alive this long. Pride had also just about killed her. "All right," she said. So quietly the fire took half the word. She stood, a little dizzy. Caleb moved without making it obvious that he meant to catch her if she fell. She didn't. She lay down with her back to the wall and her face toward the table where the child breathed. The dog lifted his head, consulted the air, then made a decision and thumped down right where he had been, declaring his post between them. "Does he have a name?" she asked, voice already blurring. "Pard," Caleb said. "Short for partner. He thinks he's half man and half stove." "Good," she murmured. "We need both." Caleb pulled a chair to the table and sat with his forearms braced on his thighs, eyes on the small rise and fall. The fire fed itself now, licking along the heartwood like someone reading a letter out loud. Sometime past the hour when bodies remember what they lost, the cabin breathed all together. Child, woman, man, dog. The storm fell away to a hush that wasn't silence so much as space. Caleb eased the cup into his palm again. The herbs had steeped to a strength he would cut with hot water. He counted the breaths between each sip and each swallow. Memory padded up, set its chin on his knee like a begging dog. He didn't push it away quickly enough. A field hospital. Lantern light straining through canvas. A boy with a band tied around his arm to keep a sleeve from slipping into the wound. His own wife's laughter from a year before, the sound ringing as if the ribs of his own chest were the bell. The color of ash. The color of ash on the day he returned to a house-shaped hole in the air. He breathed once, another. He counted Ella's breaths instead of his own, 4 in a row without a skip. He nodded to the little warrior as if they had made a pact. When dawn came, it arrived grudgingly, a yellow-bone glow that pressed at the frosted window and finally found a thumb-sized circle to look through. Caleb rose, stiff-backed, and cracked the door for a moment to listen. The snow had stopped its tantrum and lay pretending it had never been the kind of thing that killed at night. He shut the door, bent to add wood, and stilled. Clara was awake and watching him. People who had been hunted woke that way, no flinch, no gasp, just a steady gaze, an inventory taken in a breath. She sat up. The buffalo robe clutched around her shoulders like a promise she hadn't yet decided to keep. "How long?" she asked. "Most of the night." She slept. Breathing's easier. Clara's shoulders unknotted a fraction he would have missed if he hadn't been watching for it. She swung her feet to the floor, and the hound rose like a tide to meet them, weaving his head under her hands for a scratch he pretended he didn't need. "Thank you," she said again. "I've said it 100 times in my head. I'll say it 100 more." "Keep a few," he said. "You may need them." He gestured to the peg beside the hearth. "Your skirt's dry. I mended the hem." She blinked. "You sew? If you live long enough alone, you do everything badly or a few things well. Sewing is useful." He drew a kettle across the coals, steam breathing from its spout. "Eat. Drink. You'll be no help if you pass out." She ate the way starved people sometimes do, carefully, as if food might spook. A tin bowl of broth. A heel of bread. She soaked the bread, because her mouth had forgotten soft things. When the heat reached her center, color returned to her face like someone had lit a candle behind the skin. "Why did you vanish?" she asked suddenly, looking at the carved toy on the shelf, blackened on one side. She hadn't meant the question to come out that way, blunt as the back of an axe, but subtlety was a coin the poor and desperate rarely got issued. Caleb didn't pretend not to understand. "Because the people I loved were burned for loving me," he said, "and because I did not stop it." He held her gaze, not defiant, not apologizing for a thing that could not be altered. "I left before I finished turning to stone." Clara took that in, the way you take in news of a road washed out. You don't argue with the river. You look for a different crossing. And yet, you opened your door. He looked at Ella, then at Clara's hands, red and cracked where the wind had licked them raw. "Some knocks don't ask," he said. "They take." Clara nodded. Her eyes settled on Ella again, then on the small clay bowl near the hearth where Ash sat clean and white. "These herbs," she said. "They're not only from books." "No." He poured more hot water. Let steam kiss his face. "Someone taught me old ways." She believed there was more than one road to a cure. More than one language the body understood. "She?" Clara's voice softened on the edge of the word. "My wife," he said. "She was Apache." He turned the cup, remembering the shape of another hand doing the same, years ago, in a different cabin, where laughter had not sounded dangerous. Her name was Naira. Clara waited. The waiting itself was a kind of courtesy. "They said she bewitched me," he went on at last, as if reciting a fact from a ledger. "That I had traded sides, as if there were only two to begin with. They burned what they could reach. The rest they wrecked. After that I learned to build with stone and keep the chimney narrow." Clara's eyes shone with an anger that wasn't theatrical. It was the kind that had learned to crouch and wait for use. "The town I came from said something similar," she said. "That I poisoned the church by loving a man who wasn't welcome in pews. He was Comanche. His name was Coda." She smiled without joy. "They used God's name to pull him down my father's steps and into the street. I don't think God followed." Caleb lifted his head. It was a small motion. It changed the room. "I was already carrying Ella," Clara said. "I left with a blanket and a stubbornness I have regretted and also thanked 1,000 times." She swallowed, looked at her child, now dozing with her hand open like a sailor's towards a rope. "I thought the world contained two kinds of people, those who kill and those who watch. You're reminding me there's a third." "The third is lonely," he said. She met his eyes. "Not always." A thump sounded on the roof, snow sliding, nothing more. Both of them looked up anyway. That reflex would be slow to leave. Caleb rose. "I have to fetch water," he said. "I'll carry you both to the creek if I must, but I prefer not to." He pulled on his coat and hat, shouldered an old axe, then paused at the door. "If anyone knocks, no one will, but if they do, you take Ella under the stove. There's a hatch. You'll fit. Quiet as snow." Clara's mouth tightened. "Has anyone knocked before?" "Not who meant well." He looked at the hound. "Pard, watch." "No." The dog wagged once, which was hound for understood. Caleb cracked the door against a bright white morning as innocent as a lie. The cold seeped in like ink before he shut it behind him. Clara listened to his boots crunch away. The sound receding down the path cut along the eaves, then turning left toward the creek that spent winter speaking in vowels under its crust of ice. Alone with the sleeping child and the dog, Clara stood and stretched the quilts tighter around Ella's body, tucking the corners as if they were arguments she meant to win. She moved without noise, practicing a skill she had learned when silence was safer than breath. She poured the last inch of broth into her own bowl and set it near the coals to warm. She reached for her skirt at the peg and froze. On the inside of the waistband, stitched in a pattern worn by time, were 3 small leaves. Sage, by the look of them. The stitches had broken in places. She had mended them with clumsy thread on the road, 1,000 lifetimes ago 2 towns south. Her mother's hands had done the original work, the only ornament Clara had carried when ornament turned to luxury. The sight of it now, safe and ordinary on a morning where a child still breathed, broke something open inside her that didn't hurt when it broke. She pressed her lips together, then laughed, once. A sound so soft even the dog lifted his head in polite confusion. When Caleb returned, his beard salted with frost, he found Clara near the hearth tearing strips of an old flour sack for bandages, and rolling them the way he had rolled his tight, flat, ready. She looked up and didn't look away. "Teach me," she said simply. He set the pails down. "To do what?" "What you do." She nodded toward the herbs, the mortar, the careful fire. "If I had known half of it a week ago, I wouldn't have had to beg a stranger at the end of the world." She swallowed. "I would beg you anyway, but knowing would change the begging." He considered her for a long breath. "All right." He pointed with his chin. "Start with the willow bark. Tell me how you'd use it." "I'd boil it," she said confidently, and he shook his head. "You'd steep it. Boiling makes it bitter and scatters the good of it." He handed her a small knife. "Slice it thin, like shavings from a new fence rail." She set to work, fingers careful, knife slow. He corrected her grip once, lightly, then let her continue. They moved around each other without collision, the dog threading between their boots like he'd been herding them both for years. Ella coughed and blinked herself awake. She found her mother with her eyes first, then the man, and her small hand made an air gesture that might have been a wave or a test to see if the world would move when she asked. Clara was at her side immediately, the cup ready, the cloth warm. "There you are," she whispered. "We held the fire for you." Caleb watched the exchange and felt, against his will, a shift under his ribs, not a pain, not yet a relief. Something like a place giving way to a door where there had never been one. He turned to the shelf and reached behind a stack of tin plates. He drew out a small buckskin pouch he didn't remember deciding to keep and opened it. Inside lay a single earring of hammered silver, set with a fragment of turquoise the color of sky after rain. He held it in his palm a long time, then shut his hand. Not today, he told himself. Not yet. When noon leaned across the ridge and slid a blade of sun through the window-slit snow, Caleb took the axe and stepped outside to split more wood. The work steadied him. Each swing set order where cold loved ruin. He stacked the pieces in a neat crib against the wall, then paused, senses pricking. Snow carries sound. Sometimes it carries silence just as well. What he felt then was a quiet that did not belong to weather. He lifted his head. The horizon was clean. The tree line was a green line under white. Still, the hair along his forearms lifted in warning. He returned to the cabin and set the bar. "If anyone comes," he said, not dragging fear into the room, not pretending it didn't pace outside, "you go under the stove as we discussed." Clara's chin tipped up. "I won't leave you alone up here." "You won't," he said. "You'll be with her." The hound stood, all lazy ease gone, nose tilted to the crack at the bottom of the door, where the world sends its first messages. A low sound rumbled in his chest. "Maybe it's just a fox," Clara said. "Maybe it is," Caleb agreed. He set the rifle from above the hearth on the table, checked the primer, thumbed the hammer back and let it fall with a soft click to test the spring. "Maybe it's not." She looked at his face, not the gun. It told her more. "We can go," she said. And though the thought of stepping back into the white turned her bones to water, she meant it. He glanced at Ella, at the small hands that had found the carved wolf and were turning it as if investigating a new moon. "We could," he said. "But we won't. He ran once. I don't do it twice." Clara inhaled sharply, not in fear but recognition. She had made a similar promise somewhere between the second and third mile of the last day, when her legs had become arguments, and she had decided to win. "Then we stay," she said. "We stay," he echoed. They went about the rest of that day not as if trouble would never arrive, but as if the work of living was worth doing even with trouble on the path. Clara learned how much sage to crumble with rabbit tobacco, without letting bitterness rule the cup. Caleb showed her the trick of warming a reed with her own breath, before placing it between Ella's teeth. If breath faltered, never startle the mouth with cold. The body closes to what hurts. Ella slept, woke, drank, slept again. Between each small victory and the next, Clara and Caleb passed things back and forth, a bowl, a knife, a glance that did not flinch. Toward dusk, long shadows reached their fingers across the snow, counting the distance to the cabin. The hound lifted his head again and made the sound that means not fox. Caleb set the spoon down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and crossed to the door. He didn't unbar it. He listened. At first there was nothing. Then, far off but too many to be harmless, came the faint articulated metal clop of horses, picking their way along icemen who knew not to let hooves ring on stone, and so taught them to whisper. The storm had cleared the air. Sound traveled clean. Clara's eyes found his. He shook his head once under the stove. She didn't argue. She lifted Ella with more strength than she should have had, shut the child's fretting with a finger to her lips that traded fear for game, and moved to the stove, where the apron hid a low wooden hatch. She slid it back. Cold air breathed up from the root cellar. The hound moved with them, but Caleb touched his shoulder, and the dog froze, torn between posts. "Stay," Caleb whispered. Pard stayed. Caleb set the rifle within reach, and drew the old knife he used for splitting hides, long, narrow, sharp enough to cut a thought in half. He stood between door and stove, where he could pivot toward either if he misjudged. He breathed. He counted. He felt his heart slow to a hunter's pace. Hooves. Voices, low and certain. A man laughed, and even wrapped in distance, the sound carried a familiarity that pricked the old scar in his skull where a rifle butt had once rung winter like a bell. He didn't look at Clara, didn't need to. The room had entered a new kind of silence, the kind that hears everything and promises nothing. When Knuckles finally rapped the door politely, as if they had brought a basket of eggs, Caleb didn't move. "Evening to you, Cabin," a man called, voice oily with the sort of righteousness that never had to lift anything heavier than itself. "We're looking for a woman and her bastard. Folks say she ran to the hills. You'd tell us if you've seen her, wouldn't you?" Caleb could feel Clara's breath from the cellar like a second pulse under the floorboards. He laid the flat of the knife along his thigh and answered in a voice he hadn't used in years, not the surgeon, not the husband, not the hermit. Something that belonged to all of them and to none. "No," he said to the door. "I wouldn't." Outside, the horses shifted. Metal spoke softly against leather. And just like that, the mountain learned a new kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before a storm you can see. The second knock came without words, 3 measured taps that landed like stones on still water. On the floor beneath the stove, cold earth kissed Clara's cheek. She cradled Ella against her ribs, felt the small rise and fall like a bird sleeping in her hands. The hound, Pard, crouched where Caleb had placed him, muscles coiled, the low thunder in his chest a promise rather than a threat. Outside, leather creaked, horses blew steam. Then a voice, smoother than the first. "Evening, neighbor, Ezra Hale," acting under the authority of Reverend Amos Hale of Cottonwood Valley and Sheriff Donnelly of Silver Creek. "We're retrieving a woman, Clara Wynn, and an illegitimate child. Town safety, purity of worship, and the law. Open up and there won't be trouble." Caleb's mouth went dry, not from fear but recognition. Hale. The name wore the same perfume as kerosene on timber. He pressed his palm against the door as if he could feel the face on the other side through pitch and grain. "I don't open to men who bring the law tied to a church," he said. A chuckle answered the first voice again, the one that liked the sound of his own teeth. "Hear that, Ezra? The mountain rat thinks he can teach us civics." Ezra spoke without raising his voice. "Sir, we'll give you a minute to reconsider." Caleb angled his head toward the small square of window glass near the roofline. The winter sky had blued toward evening, the color that bleeds into iron right before it turns to night. He took a slow step back, set the rifle on the table within reach, and lifted the old hide knife into his right hand. Beneath the stove hatch, Clara's breath came shallow and quiet. Ezra. She had known he would come one day. The Reverend's son, Sunday sweet and Friday cruel, who had chased her with scripture and hunger both, and called it courtship. He had put the first stones in the pockets of the river that pulled Coda under. He had told her father she was a stain only the Lord could scour. He had promised to save her by breaking her. Above her, Caleb's voice shifted, iron wrapped in cloth. "You brought a sheriff's name," he said. "Did you bring the sheriff?" No answer. Just the click of a rifle being cocked in answer, honest, at least, in a way the words had not been. Pard's head lifted. The hound's nose spoke. Men at 5 paces, 3 more behind, another off to the left near the woodpile. Caleb counted them without seeing, the way a man counts breaths, when he must not forget how many are left. Then a different sound, a single boot scuff, then a small tap on the door, like a polite neighbor borrowing salt. "Caleb Vance?" A new voice called, threaded with something neither Hale nor the other men owned hesitation. "Silas Ward. I rode with these men for the sheriff when he takes ill. I'm not here by choice." He lowered his voice. "There's 8. Ezra's got kerosene. They mean to smoke you out." Clara heard it from under the hatch, as clearly as if the floorboards were a drum. She tightened her hold around Ella's ears. The child slept, not believing in men's plans. Caleb's eyes flicked to the hearth. Smoke climbed straight. The draft was true. He had rebuilt the chimney mouth twice until it drew like a throat singing. Fire would not choke them quickly. But kerosene had its own language. "Silas," Caleb said, shaping the name like a question and a judgment both. "Why announce yourself?" A pause. Because I remember a field tent at Antietam, Silas said softly, so the men behind him had to lean to hear. Mud up to a man's heart. A surgeon who cut my boot off and set my foot in time to keep me walking. You never asked my name then. You're walking now, Caleb said. Because of you. Another of the riders snorted. You done with your love letter, Ward? Ezra, I'm freezing. Let's light this rat's nest and be home for stew. Ezra sighed the way a pastor does when disappointed by a child. Last chance, cabin. The woman belongs to her father's house. The child belongs in charity. You hand them over, and I'll forget I saw you. Caleb let the calm inside him rise the way cold air settles, slow, heavy, precise. You'll leave the mountain, he said. All of you. The men laughed. Ezra didn't. Open, he said. No more oil on the word. Just a match head. They didn't wait for an answer. A boot struck the door. The beam held but popped in its bracket with a crack that startled the rafters. Caleb stepped back into the space he had already measured with his body, the place that anchored a room full of angles. The second kick tore iron from wood. On the third, the beam flew against the wall, and the door sprang inward like a jaw. Snow swirled Night's first breath entering the cabin, as if curious, and then shadows filled the threshold. The first man through was big and quick, certain of what he would find, a tired hermit, a woman sobbing, an easy righteousness. He met instead the flat of Caleb's knife and the barrel of a rifle not fired in years. The man's certainty died first. He stumbled back into Ezra's chest, cursed, and spun right as Caleb stepped through the space he had made, not out of the cabin, but sideways, bringing the fight to the threshold, where only one man could enter at a time. Don't shoot, Silas Ward barked. You'll hit. The shot went high, slammed sparks off the lintel, and stitched a burn across Caleb's hat brim. Pard leapt like a thrown weight, went low, and took the second man's knee out from under him with a crack like sap in January. The man screamed and buckled. Hold, Ezra shouted, voice rigid. We're not butchers. Bring them out clean, not butchers. Ezra, who had held a man underwater with a prayer on his lips, saying it like a blessing. Caleb drove his shoulder into the first rider's sternum and heaved him back into the snow, where the night welcomed the breath out of him. He pivoted, caught the third blow on his forearm, let the pain ring through bone, and turned it into a slice that took cloth and pride both. The man howled and dropped his rifle, grabbed for a knife, and met the hound's teeth instead. Silas Ward appeared in the doorway, eyes cutting left and right with the clarity of a man who wanted to live and wanted, more stubbornly, to deserve it. He didn't raise his gun. He used his hands. He grabbed Ezra's coat with the practiced intimacy of someone who had once pulled him out of a different kind of trouble and hissed, "Stop! There's a child." Ezra's jaw tightened. "There is sin," he said. Then, to his men, "Back. We'll smoke them gentle." "Gentle?" one scoffed. "Gentle enough to drag them out," Ezra said. "We'll be charitable. The law will decide." The law, thought Caleb, picturing Donnelly, whose law was a mirror he only polished when he needed to see himself handsome. Smoke would come in low. Kerosene climbed everything it touched. Caleb stepped back into the cabin, kicked the door shut to test how the latch would hold half broken. He knew now, not long. He looked at the stove. Clara's eyes were 2 coins in the dark, as she eased the hatch just enough to see his boots. "Under," he whispered. Silent. Her hand reached through the slit and touched the edge of his boot. It was nothing, almost. It steadied him more than a wall would have. He moved fast and without noise, banked the hearth to coals, dragged a wet hide from a peg and flung it over the gap at the door's bottom, grabbed the clay bowl of ash, and scattered a line around the threshold. He poured water along the sill until it pooled. Smoke would still crawl in. It would be slowed. Then, a choice that felt like a betrayal and a vow at once. He reached to the shelf and took down the buckskin pouch. The silver earring lay in his palm like a snowflake that refused to melt. Not today. He opened the stove hatch a hand's width, slid the pouch into the dark, and nudged it until Clara's fingers found it. A breath, a pressure. She took it. The smell hit first kerosene, sharp and stupid under the honest sense of pine and iron and breath. A man coughed outside, theatrically. Another laughed to cover his own. Silas Ward's voice cut through. "Ezra, don't." The match scratched. The world inhaled. Fire is greedy. It leapt to the wet hide and snarled, found the line of ash and spat, kissed water and shrieked, then darted for the crack above the jamb, where men and years had left a seam. Smoke shouldered the door and slid in thin at first, then thick, a living thing learning a room's weak points with a pickpocket's hands. Caleb wrapped a wet cloth around his mouth and nose, shoved the second under the door's crack, and went to his knees to work the draft. Damper half closed, stove door cracked, window latch lifted a hair. Smoke rushed toward that whisper of escape, argued with the fire's hunger, and raced up the chimney with a sound like a rope dragging fast over stone. Outside, men swore as their smoke retreated up instead of in. "More oil," someone growled. "Stop," Silas snapped. "You'll light the ridge. Then God will see it better," Ezra said lightly. Clara felt the heat gather in the hatch and held Ella's mouth close to her skin where the air was coolest. The child stirred, coughed once, and settled. Clara pressed her lips to her hair, breathed through the fear until air became possible again. Her hand closed around the pouch Caleb had slipped to her. Her thumb found the outline of the silver and the cool of the stone. A promise, she thought, and didn't ask what that made her to it. The door exploded inward on the next kick, a hinge shearing so loud the rafters flinched. The wet hide tore. Smoke rolled over the threshold like a black tide. Through it, Ezra Hale stepped, coat unbuttoned like a sermon, hat brim clean, eyes bright with mission. He lifted a lantern high to own the room with light, and for a moment the smoke itself seemed to obey him, wreathing rather than choking. "Enough," he said, as if he had been merciful already. "In the name of—" Pard hit him like a low-slung hammer and took him to the floorboards. The lantern flew from Ezra's hand and shattered on a log near the woodpile, splashing oil across split pine. Flames skittered up the stack like children racing stairs. "Back!" Silas Ward roared, bursting in behind, shoving his shoulder under the flaming stack to flip it away from the wall. He batted at the fire with his coat, curses and prayers braided together. Another rider lunged through with a blanket. Caleb met him, grabbed the edge, twisted, and used the man's weight to throw him into the snow outside again. He slammed the door with the last of the hinge and jammed a saw handle through the latch as a pin. "Drop the gun, Vance," Ezra gasped, struggling under Pard's righteous gravity. "Don't make this murder." Caleb's eyes found Ezra's and held them the way a man holds a map to firelight. "You came to a house with oil and men and lies. If death wants a name, it'll wear yours." Ezra bared his teeth. "Clara," he shouted, as if she hovered outside the smoke waiting for his voice. "Think of your father. Think of your soul. That man," he jerked his chin at Caleb, "is a heathen who married a savage and lives like an animal. You'll burn with him." Clara stared up from the cellar, smoke writing a script across the hatch that she refused to read. A laugh rose in her small, fierce, surprised at itself. "I already burned," she thought. "I'm still here." Silas got the last of the fire smothered. He spun on Ezra, shoving him with both hands. "You said we'd bring them out to the sheriff," he hissed. "You brought oil." "One." Ezra's smile was sweet enough to rot teeth. "We brought options. The Lord provides." "Don't use his name to light a match," Silas said, and something in his voice made Pard lift his head and wag once as if honoring a proper sentence in a room full of lies. Outside, the remaining riders shifted, uncertain. Smoke and shouting had a way of stealing courage. Snow settled inch by inch on hat brims and shoulders, turning men into ghosts of the men they were. Inside, air thinned. Caleb's chest burned like the woodpile had and then didn't. He moved by habit and map. Open the window an inch more, draw smoke higher, keep the low air as clean as a poor house can afford. He felt the room tilting toward a decision, the kind that changes a life by the angle a knife takes or doesn't. "Ward," he said, not shifting his eyes from Ezra, "there's a hatch under the stove. I've got a child and her mother there. We'll walk out together, slow, into clean air. You'll keep your men off. If one of them raises a gun, I put Hale down. If none do, everyone goes home with their bones still speaking." Silas weighed it with the kind of speed a man learns when delay kills. He nodded once. "All right," he said, and raised his voice toward the door. "Guns down, we're bringing a child out." A voice outside Harper, if the laugh had a name, sneered. "And the WH? Guns down," Silas repeated, and this time his voice carried the sheriff's authority the badge had left him to borrow. "Ezra, you too." Ezra's fingers flexed. He didn't lower his pistol. He rolled it in his hand like a prayer bead. "The woman is mine to redeem," he murmured. "The child is the proof." "Lower it," Silas said. Ezra smiled and cocked the hammer. He didn't see Clara rise like fire itself from the hatch behind the stove, a dark angel born of smoke and winter and decision. She came up with Ella in one arm, and, in the other, the iron poker from the hearth, held low and tight the way Coda had taught her to hold a spear the night he showed her how to fish a river. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She moved. The poker caught Ezra across the wrist with a sound like a frozen branch breaking. His pistol flew. Pard's teeth found Ezra's coat again and held. Silas, fast, kicked the pistol across the room, scooped Ella from Clara's arm with a soldier's efficiency, and turned his body to make himself a wall between the child and every bullet that had not yet decided not to fly. Caleb was already at Clara's side, his hand on her back steadying her, his body a second wall. Smoke thinned in the draft he'd made. Air returned in a sting. Outside, confusion turned into standoff. Two of the riders raised guns on reflex. The others hesitated. The mountains leaned close to hear. Silas lifted Ella high enough for every man at the threshold to see. "A child," he called. "You shoot, and you answer for it." Ezra strained under Pard, eyes bright with a madness that smelled like incense. "She's a stain," he hissed. "You don't cleanse a stain with pity. You don't cleanse it all with fire," Silas snapped. "You just hide the dirt in smoke." Caleb eased Clara backward toward the door, his free hand never leaving her spine. "We're going to air," he said in her ear. "Slow." She nodded once. Her eyes were wet and bright and hard as creek ice. She was not crying. Smoke had put shine where tears used to live. They reached the threshold. Snow bit their ankles. Clean cold clawed their lungs. Kinder than smoke, hungrier than breath. The riders outside shifted to make a corridor and discovered they had formed a kind of honor guard without meaning to. Men are funniest when decency ambushes them. Caleb stepped into the yard first, Clara at his side, Silas behind them with Ella wrapped in his coat. Pard backed, still pinning Ezra until the last moment, then sprang clear and planted himself between his people and the door, teeth bared, a monarch with a crown of slobber and soot. "Mount up," Silas called to the men who weren't Ezra. "We're done." Harper spat. "Like hell." "Exactly like," Silas said. "Mount." They hesitated. It takes a while for men who live off someone else's certainty to notice when it's gone. The mountains noticed first. They sent a single blade of sun through the cloud, a slant of gold that found Clara's hair and made a halo Faith couldn't have bought for her in town. Ezra staggered to his feet, cradling his wrist, eyes scorching where smoke had not. "You think this is over?" he hissed, quieter now, which made it worse. "You think you can steal what the Lord marked? I'll bring the sheriff himself. I'll bring the judge. I'll bring your past, Vance, and hang it from your eaves." Caleb's breath smoked in front of him as he measured the distance between forgiveness and folly. He didn't raise his rifle. He raised his voice, level and final. "This ridge is home," he said. "If you come again, you won't speak on it." "No." Silas put a hand out, palm toward Caleb, palm toward Ezra, offering two men equal chance to choose the smaller hell. "Ezra, go," he said. "You bring the sheriff if you must, but bring him honest. No oil, no church, just the law, and you might find out what it's worth." Ezra glared at Silas, as if betrayal were a new word he'd discovered was spelled with 4 letters. Then he spat blood into the snow, whistled, and his horse came like a trained accusation. He mounted left-handed, hissed when the wrist complained, and jerked his chin. The others wheeled in a clatter of hooves that sounded to Clara like a congregation fleeing a sermon that had turned on them. They rode. Snow swallowed sound. The ridge breathed. Silas did not mount. He stood with Ella still tucked in his coat and looked at Caleb like a man studying a photograph of himself from a war his children didn't ask about. "I'll go down alone," he said finally. "I'll tell Donnelly what happened. He'll bluster. He'll send me back up with a question mark instead of a warrant. If Ezra rides to the judge, there'll be paper. If there's paper, there'll be time. Caleb nodded. Thank you. Silas shook his head. Don't thank me yet. I did a little wrong with a big wrong. That doesn't make a right. He took a breath that hurt. But I aim to do more of the little right, and none of the big wrong from here out. Caleb held out his arms for Ella. The child came like a bundle of obligations and blessings wrapped in one, the way life prefers to package the things that matter. If you come back, Caleb said to Silas, come as a friend, or a lawman who means it, not both. A corner of Silas's mouth tried on a smile it hadn't worn in years. I'll see what fits. He touched the brim of his hat to Clara and to the child as if the mountain itself had introduced them. Then he swung into the saddle and rode down the path alone, deliberate as prayer. When he was a dark speck against white and then a memory, the ridge resumed its old work, holding up the sky, catching stray clouds, letting the wind practice its songs. Inside the cabin, smoke still wrote its letters in the rafters. The hearth coals glowed sullen, then bright as Caleb teased life back into them. Clara sank onto the bench and reached for water with hands that shook now, after. That's when shaking comes, when there's room for it. Caleb set Ella in a nest of quilts near the fire. The child's breath, so recently counted now, counted themselves. He turned and found Clara's eyes. For a second, no history stood between them, no winter, no towns, no names men had tried to pin on their backs. Just two people whose stubborn had matched and lived. Are you hurt? He asked. Only where I remember, she said, and almost smiled. She opened her hand then, palm up, and showed him the buckskin pouch. You'll need this back. He didn't reach for it. The decision had already moved in and warmed a chair. It's not mine anymore. Then whose? Yours if you want it, he said. It was my wife's, Naira's. I can't give you her death. I won't try to give you her place. I can give you my promise. He swallowed, the word catching like a fishbone, and then sliding free. I protect what's in my house. I keep what lives under my roof alive. If you stay, you're under my roof. Clara looked down at the pouch, thumbed the edge, then loosened the thong. The earring lay like a sliver of bright sky in her palm. She didn't put it on. She closed her fist around it and held it against her heart just once, as if measuring it to the beat there. I don't know what staying means yet, she said. It means nothing you don't want it to mean, he said. Except safe. She nodded. A tear finally made the long walk from her eye to her jaw. She didn't wipe it. Safe sounds like a storybook word, she whispered. Today, it sounds like a door I can close. Pard chuffed, circled twice, and flopped with his spine to the stove as if to say, try me then. See if I let anybody open it wrong. They set to work, because work is the best bridge between battle and sleep. Caleb rehung the door on its last hinge with a cleverness that promised to hold a while. Clara scrubbed the scour of smoke from the pot and made a thin stew that tasted better than memory. Ella woke enough to take 3 spoonfuls and then drifted, a smile caught at the corner of her mouth like a kite snagged in a branch, stuck, but wanting the sky. When the cabin was as right as it could be for a night that had tried to take it, Caleb opened the narrow window and let the mountains settle in. Outside, the world had gone quiet in that particular way snow makes, full of sound if you know how to listen. An owl passed by without asking permission. Somewhere far down the slope, a branch surrendered with a crack and didn't mind. Clara sat at the table with the earring on the wood grain between them. She traced the turquoise with a fingertip, then looked up. He'll come back, she said, not question, not fear. Geography. He might, Caleb said. But not tonight. 2. And the sheriff? She asked. Silas will buy us time, he said. Time's a bargain if you spend it. She nodded, and her gaze went to the door, to the new splintered scars and the places where the wood, despite everything, still joined the frame. What will you spend it on? Caleb's eyes slid to Ella, to the small wolf in her hand, to the hound who dreamed with his paws twitching. He stood, took his coat from the peg, and opened it to show her the inside seam, torn and restitched a dozen times. First, he said, mending, and after that. He picked up a length of rawhide and a handful of nails and glanced at the wall where the fence posts leaned, half-shaped. Building what doesn't burn easy. She watched him a long time, long enough that the candle guttered and the fire took over the work of light. "Caleb," she said finally. He looked up. "You asked me to stay," she said. "I haven't said yes. Not yet." She swallowed. "But if I do, I won't be a mouth added to your table. I'll be hands." His mouth found a shape that could one day be laughter. "Good," he said. "I've got more work than one pair can do." She stood and crossed the small room. The distance hardly mattered. In cabins like this, inches are something else. She held out the earring. He set his rough fingers over her smooth ones and didn't move to take it. Her hand stayed under his in the hollows where two lives meet, awkward at first, then less so. A sound interrupted them. Not a knock, not a hoof, but something soft and stubbornly alive, the scratch of a knife on wood outside. Caleb stilled. Clara tilted her head, listening. It wasn't near the door. It came from the pine beyond the eaves. He opened the door and stepped into the clean cold. Clara followed, wrapping a shawl high. The sky had unlatched and thrown a handful of stars above the ridge. Snow lit everything from below. At the edge of the trees, Silas Ward stood with his back to them, carving into the bark of an old pine, his horse ground-tied a pace off, steam haloing his hat. He didn't startle when they approached. He finished a stroke, stepped back, and read what he had written. "Won't stay," he said, half to them, half to the tree. I needed to leave something that wasn't a lie." "Oi." Caleb stood beside him and saw the words, the knife marks clean and certain. "If you come clean." Silas wiped the blade on his coat, slid it home, and swung into the saddle. "If Donnelly rides me up here with a warrant," he said, "I'll bring him to this tree first." He looked at Clara, then at Caleb, and nodded once more like a man tipping his hat to a grave he intends to honor, then to another man. "Spend your time," he said, and disappeared into the white, his horse choosing the path like it had learned the mountain's handwriting long ago. They stood at the tree a long minute after he'd gone. Clara reached out and touched the letters with the tips of 2 fingers, as if reading them in Braille. "Come clean," she murmured. "I don't know that the town has ever done that." "Then the mountain will teach them," Caleb said. She looked at him, and the night set their faces in a strange, gentle mirror. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll start with the willow bark, and you'll show me the difference between steep and boil." "I will." "And you'll teach Ella to breathe like you breathed for her." "I will." "And if Ezra comes with the law clean," she glanced at the words on the bark, "we'll meet it." "We will," he said. They went inside and barred the scarred door. The cabin sighed the way a body does when it decides for now to sleep instead of argue. Caleb banked the fire. Clara set the earring on the mantel, not as an altar, not as a claim, but as a star. Ella dreamed. Pard snored like a broken hymn. Outside, the mountain wore its white without apology. The twist of the night, a lawman who remembered, a preacher's son who broke on a hound's mercy, a woman rising from smoke with iron in her hand, settled into the room like a new piece of furniture, briefly strange, suddenly necessary. A thing you bruise yourself on once, and then learn to walk around, proud of the ache. Caleb lay down on the floor near the hearth with his arm thrown over his eyes, a habit from field tents where lanterns never stayed dark. Clara took the bed again. Ella curled in the crook of her body, a comma in a sentence that had found its way to a better clause. Before sleep reached her, Clara whispered a line into the low light, a prayer, maybe, or a plan. "Come clean," she said to the room, and meant it for everyone who might set their boots on this ridge. Then she let the mountain keep the rest of the night. By the time the sun thawed the edge of the ridge, the mountain no longer looked like a battlefield. Smoke rose slow and thin from the cabin chimney, drifting into the pale blue morning, as though the storm had only been a bad dream. Caleb Vance stepped outside with an axe in hand and a calm that had been years coming. His breath made small ghosts in the air, vanishing almost as quickly as they formed. Behind him, the sound of a woman's soft humming carried through the open door, a tune neither hymn nor lullaby, just something warm enough to live by. Inside, Clara Wynn stirred a pot over the fire. Her sleeves were rolled high, her hair loose around her face, and the faintest smile curved her mouth. Ella sat on the floor beside the old hound, stacking bits of wood like a fortress. Each breath she took seemed to light another candle in the room. For the first time in 9 winters, the cabin didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like home. Caleb watched the world without flinching. He'd once believed solitude was safety, that walls kept the past out. But walls couldn't heal, they only echoed the pain inside them. When Clara and her child came through his door, he thought he was saving a life. Somewhere between fire and snowfall, he realized they had saved his instead. By noon, he was splitting pine to mend the fence that the raiders had trampled. Clara worked beside him, holding each board steady as he drove the nails. They didn't speak much. Words were slow travelers here, but every shared motion stitched a quiet promise between them. When the fence stood straight again, Caleb leaned on his hammer and looked toward the tree line where Silas Ward had carved his message. "If you come clean." He read it again and nodded. The mountain had a new law now, one made not by judges or preachers, but by the people who had survived its cold. Later, Clara brought out 2 mugs of pine needle tea. "It's bitter," she said, "but good for the blood." Caleb smiled faintly. "You steeped, not boiled." She returned his smile. "I learned fast." As the light dimmed to amber, Ella climbed into her mother's lap and pointed to the horizon. "Mama, the sky's pink." Clara looked up. "That means tomorrow will be calm." "Lead." Caleb knelt beside the child, brushing a curl from her forehead. "It means we get another day," he said. They ate supper by the fire, bread, stew, and quiet laughter. The cabin walls glowed with a peace that neither of them dared name too soon. But when Clara reached for Caleb's bandaged hand to change the wrapping, she didn't pull away afterward. Her fingers lingered, tracing the calluses, the life that had been burned and rebuilt. He met her eyes and saw not pity, but belonging. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, unthreatening, as if the mountain had finally forgiven itself. Caleb rose, went to the doorway, and pressed his palm against the frame where the wood was scarred. Then, with the same careful patience he gave to every wound he'd ever tended, he carved 6 words into the beam above the door. "She's still breathing, and so am I." When he stepped back, Clara stood beside him, her head against his shoulder, Ella drowsing in her arms. The fire behind them painted their shadows long across the floor. No vows were spoken, no promises sworn. Yet in that quiet moment, every heartbeat in that room said the same thing. That love, once buried beneath grief, had found its way back to the surface. And this time, it would stay. 12 winters passed. The Bitterroot Mountains still held their crown of snow, but the cabin beneath their shadow had changed. Its roof was stronger, its walls smoother, and the sound that rose from it was no longer the hush of loneliness but the rhythm of life. In the yard, Clara Wynn knelt among the thawing herbs, her braids catching the morning light. She was 12 now, steady, sun-touched, and as much mountain as girl. Her hands moved with the same quiet confidence as her mother's once had, plucking juniper and sage into a small pouch tied at her belt. Each leaf she picked, she whispered to first, as her father had taught her. Inside, Clara sat at the table, writing in a leather-bound journal whose pages smelled faintly of smoke and pine. "The day I begged for someone to bury my child was the day I buried my faith," she wrote. But he did not bury her. He breathed life into her and somehow into me. Caleb Vance stood by the hearth, older now, his beard streaked with silver, his eyes clearer for it. He was binding the wrist of a traveler, a Shoshone man with a hunting wound, while his daughter ground herbs into a paste beside him. Once, he had lived to forget the war. Now, he lived to heal. When the work was done, the visitor rose, thanked them both, and left down the trail that curved into the valley. Caleb followed him to the door and watched until he vanished among the trees. The world beyond no longer frightened him. The world within was enough. That evening, the family walked out to the great pine where Silas Ward's carving still marked the bark. Below it, another set of words gleamed in newer strokes, etched by Caleb's hand and finished by Clara's. "She's still breathing, and so am I." The wind moved softly through the needles. Ella took her parents' hands, her small fingers warm in theirs. Together they stood in silence as the sun slipped behind the mountains, setting the sky aflame. For a moment, the light caught on the silver earring Clara wore, turning it into a star. Caleb looked at her, at the life that had begun with a knock on a door and a whisper in the snow. Some love stories, he thought, don't begin with promises, they begin with mercy. And under that forgiving Montana sky, the mountains kept their secret, that from grief, grace can grow, And from silence, love can speak again.